Okay, so we've talked about this concept of it being a dry world and how cultures interact with that physical environment. Then the other two kind of maybe stereotypes or kind of the way people conceptualize North Africa, Southwest Asia, is this an Arab world? We'll talk about what that means, and is it true, or is it the Islamic world? And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And this is a map. Now, the term Arab refers to culture, and particularly also it's also a linguistic thing as well, that there are Arab languages. And this is a map showing a linguistic map of this part of the world. Now, a couple of things that I'll highlight here. This in yellow here, let me go back a little bit. This part in yellow with the number 5 is where people speak Arabic. And so where people speak Arabic is probably an approximation of where you have Arab culture. But one thing you might notice is that as you get further north, you do have some differences that we'll discuss as well. And a slight bit up here in the North Africa as well. All right, so Arabic is the dominant language in this part of the world, both in North Africa and extending into the Arabian Peninsula. But you do have exceptions as well, that as you go further north into Turkey, that their culture is different, that Turks don't necessarily, they don't consider themselves Arabs. They have a different culture and a different language. They speak, it's a whole different family called the Turkic languages. Also related to some of the languages spoken in Central Asia, in the Stan countries that we've discussed. And as you go into the area near Iran, you have Iranian or Persian languages, which are a completely different, they're actually in the Indo-European family. In fact, the languages spoken in Iran are more closely related to English than they are to Arabic. So the point being, this is a place of exceptions, that there is something that's generally true, but there's also notable exceptions as well. So let's take a quick annotated view of this language map. So Arabic is the big dominant language throughout this realm. And we have two large exceptions. We have Turkic languages in again, one of the most populated countries of Turkey, and Iranian, which in the area of Iran, and extending into some other countries as well. Now, if you notice that this here, number 6, is, we have 5, 5, 5s, and we have 6. This is the Hebrew language spoken in Israel, which is also a relative of Arabic, that they are kind of like how English and German are related to each other, that these are as well. These are a different language group. These are what's called Berber. This is kind of an older language group that existed prior to the expansion of people who spoke Arabic into this part of the world. And so there are still some pockets of places where you have the coexistence of Arabic and other more native languages. Here's maybe one thing to highlight here is that these are different language families. So the Afro-Asiatic family, which includes the Semitic group, including Arabic and Hebrew, also Berber languages. And then Turkic is in a whole completely different language family. So, as well as, and Indo-European languages are a completely different family, which includes Iranian as well. Here's kind of a view of the distribution of these different major language families. So you have Indo-European in Europe, but you also have it extending into Iran, and then all the way into India as well, and Bangladesh. That Indo-European languages are spoken up in Europe, but also down, there are distant relatives of them in Iran and elsewhere. Then Afro-Asiatic pretty much from the Arabian Peninsula through North Africa. I resized the graphics, so I had to move the labels a little bit. So Turkic here, Turkic in Central Asia, Indo-European here, Indo-European in Europe. And if you look at the Turkic languages, you can see they kind of extend all the way up into Siberia. And this is from the migrations of people kind of back and forth along from all the way from here all the way up into Siberia. Same thing with Indo-European, different migrations of people over time. And with Arabic, a lot of that had to do with expansion of Arabic empires into different places, bringing their language with them as well. So with the, is it in Arab world? Largely yes, but not always so. Is it the Islamic world? And here the answer is a little bit different. This is a very important part of the Islamic world. It's where the Islamic religion originated. However, nowadays, the Islamic world is much larger. It's not only limited to this part of the world, it's much larger in other places like Southeast Asia, Africa, and other places. So, however, what we can say is Islam is the dominant religion in this part of the world. This part of the world is home to three what we call monotheistic, and I'll include a video that talks about this a bit. 3 monotheistic religions, including Judaism, which is the oldest, Christianity, which is kind of branched off from Judaism and carried some of the traditions, and likewise Islam, which is the newest of relatively newest of the 3. It's not new, but it's hundreds of years old, but it is the newest of these 3, and it also carries traditions including some from Judaism and Christianity. So these are, the point being is that these 3 monotheistic religions developed in the same part of the world and are not completely unrelated to each other. They do carry some of the, for example, the figure of Abraham is common throughout the 3 religions. Now for Islam itself, there are different sects of Islam, different divisions, and the 2 major ones are Sunni and Shia. And there are some other smaller ones as well, but Sunni is the dominant sect, that there are both here and elsewhere in the world, that about 85% plus of people who practice Islam consider themselves Sunni. And the difference between the 2 had to do with the power struggle that emerged early on in the religion. Some of the followers wanted the leader of the church to be selected, kind of voted for and selected in a more democratic process. Some wanted it to be led by a relative of the original Prophet Muhammad. I'll include a video explainer on this. But the ones that wanted the relative to take over are the smaller group called the Shia. And one thing I'll point out, and they're shown here in kind of this bluish color, and where you really, the heart of the Shiite sect of the Islam religion is in Iran, but also extends into part of Iraq and some other places as well. There are about perhaps 10 to 15% of people who practice Islam consider themselves Shiite. So here, let's the green color here, and this is kind of limited to the realm that we're talking about. Is the green color is Sunni, the kind of the more blue color is the Shiite sect, mostly in Iran, but extending into southeast Iraq and some other places like the coast of Syria, Yemen. One thing to note about Iraq is that this doesn't look like much, but this is where most of the people live. This is along the Tigris and Euphrates River. So they actually are a majority, slightly so, majority of people in Iraq are Shiite as well. And the vast majority of people in Iran are. And while this does not directly cause political differences, it is one element that we'll see when we talk about the splits between these different countries. Oftentimes that the different groups will align along these religious lines. Maybe what else to point out here, we have also Jewish here in Israel. So Israel is kind of an exception. We'll talk about Israel. It was kind of carved out as a Jewish homeland, so it's a little bit different. And we also have a little pockets of, for example, Christianity in places like Lebanon, some other places. And this is from a different geography book, but kind of showing what's happening, as we go further south. As you go further south, Islam continues to be dominant. However, there's a transition as we get into sub-Saharan Africa, where in sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to have kind of a transitional zone, and then more of a mix of Christianity and in other indigenous religions. All right, so is this the Islamic world? And it depends kind of like how we are defining this. Are we defining this by percentages? Or are we defining this by actual numbers of people? By percentages, clearly so, that this part of the south and extending into, nearby areas, this part of the world has very high percentages of people who consider themselves Muslim. However, one thing that we need to be mindful of is when we talked about the population, we discussed that this area is not the most densely populated of places in the world. So there's high percentages, but lower populations. So in fact, if we looked at the Muslim population by country, it turns out that we have to go through a kind of a pretty decent list of countries until we get to a country that's in the NASWA realm. For example, the country with the most people who practice Islam is Indonesia, which has, because Indonesia's a big country. We're going to talk about that later. Over 200 million adherents to the religion because it's a bigger country. Pakistan, big country as well. India, and this is only 15% of the population of India, but because India is so big, that's a huge number of people. And these are more people than the maximum population of Egypt or Turkey or Iran. And even Nigeria in sub-Saharan Africa has a fairly substantial Muslim population. And then finally we get down to Egypt, Iran, Turkey. Now, Egypt, Iran, Turkey, they have high percentages of people who practice Islam, but because they're smaller countries, they're not, that Islam is much bigger than that. So if we look at Islam as a whole, it extends pretty far beyond. It's not limited to North Africa, Southwest Asia. It extends into Central Asia, to Kazakhstan, other countries, and then down into Indonesia, Southeast Asia. So probably the point here is that while this area has, or this is where Islam originated and has high concentrations of people who practice the faith is actually much bigger, extends into other realms as well. And one reason for that is because the diffusion or expansion of religion. And so this is a figure showing the diffusion of Islam that originated in the city of Mecca and the Arabian Peninsula. This is the kind of the heart where people, were of the religion, but then expanded outward. And there's different kinds of expansion. Some of it was just kind of like radiating out from that core. Then some of it was brought through trade into places like East Africa or the East Indies, where modern day Indonesia is, or even around to the Ganges Delta. So let's stop and focus on that concept for a moment. This is the concept known as spatial diffusion. It's a transfer or movement of people, ideas, and things. And the idea in kind of cultural geography or anthropology even is that diffusion is what causes cultural changes. Ideas come from other places. Globalization is an example of mass spatial diffusion of ideas and culture. And we can kind of separate these into two types. Expansion, where outward expansion spread from a strong core location, like starting in Mecca and spreading outward into North Africa and the Middle East. Or also relocation, with examples like the Indonesia or the Ganges Delta, modern day Bangladesh. These are places where through migration and trade, the religion was brought to distant locations. And before we end that topic, I will point out too that there has also been expansion of Islam into Europe as well. and through into Spain and into part of the Balkans. But that's about as far as it really got. And then through different, through historical conflicts and things, that the Islamic empires in Spain have kind of gotten pushed back out. This was part of the later Ottoman Empire that we'll talk about, that expanded into the Balkan areas, but then kind of shrunk back over time. But so even parts of Europe at one time were either ruled by empires that were Islamic based, such as the Ottoman Empire, and in Andalusia, the southern part of Spain.